Is there a hidden agenda in the American criminal justice system? Is fair and impartial administration of justice the only core mission of the criminal justice system? Is there a more sinister reason behind the laws and punishment as they are handed down by the judge? Does the system work to suppress the political power of certain racial groups and ultimately prevent the accumulation of wealth? Can the criminal justice system be labeled the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander argues in her book? These are some of the questions we'll deal with in this video. And like always, use the information presented to do your own research. Knowledge is power, and your life is a result of the choices you make. So, just a quick history lesson here to bring us up to speed. If we take an honest look at American history, we'll see that African Americans have always been at the bottom rungs of society. Even though significant progress has been made, there has always been an effort by the system to keep African Americans in the trenches. Before the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, American economy and social balance flourished because African Americans were in a state of constant dehumanization. For more than 200 years, African Americans were forced to work for free while being treated worse than animals. The Emancipation Proclamation, as signed by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. While this law didn't immediately take effect, it motivated a lot of African Americans to essentially join the war and fight for their freedom. By the end of the Civil War, about 180,000 African Americans were in the Army, and another 200,000 were serving in the Navy. So once the Emancipation Proclamation really kicked in and made it illegal to have slaves, the former slave owners and white America in general were not really ready to accept this new reality. So they passed laws to duplicate the conditions that existed during slavery. These were called Jim Crow laws. They found a way to exploit a loophole in the 13th Amendment, which said slavery is illegal unless it was a punishment for a crime. So guess what they did? They concocted all sorts of laws that targeted African Americans and justified their imprisonment. And back then, prison was pretty much working on the plantations. While some of these Jim Crow laws seemed like they were simply motivated by hatred for African Americans, a lot of them laid the groundwork that legally prevented African Americans from generating wealth. Jim Crow laws kept African Americans from voting. It made learning to read and write practically impossible. African Americans couldn't buy land, and it gave landlords the right to deny housing because of race. The true creators of these laws knew the impact the laws would have, and they sought to keep African Americans as a permanent underclass. For example, the Supreme Court upheld a Mississippi law that limited the right to vote to those who owned property or those that could read. While race wasn't even mentioned in this Mississippi law, there were already laws on the books that made learning how to read and the purchase of land impossible for black folks. So the only people affected by this law was black folks. At this point, the Supreme Court could have said it wasn't about race, but realistically, it's always been about race. In 1896, Louisiana had over 100,000 registered African American voters. 8 years later, only about 1,000 African Americans were registered to vote. And why is voting important, you ask? It is your right as a citizen to have a say in the things that happen in your federal, state, city, and local government. Voting gives you that voice. So what does any of this have to do with life today? If we look at the signs of the times, we'll see that history has a funny way of repeating itself. Is it by chance, or is there a reason behind the things that happen? Well, let's look at the evidence. When African Americans thought they were about to get a chunk of the American dream with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it didn't take long for Jim Crow laws to come right along and derail that dream. Jim Crow laws kept African Americans in an underclass status up until the 1960s with the passing of groundbreaking laws like the Voting Rights and Fair Housing Act. These laws were like the Emancipation Proclamation in that it leveled the playing field by prohibiting racial discrimination in voting, and the Fair Housing Act made racial discrimination illegal in the housing market. And wouldn't you know it, again, just when African Americans thought finally that piece of the American dream was within reach, they were in for another setback. This setback came in the form of the war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Just like Jim Crow laws made it legal to prevent African Americans from mainstream society, the war on drugs made it legal to keep a large number of African Americans out of mainstream society through laws that targeted black folks without directly referring to race. Through convictions for nonviolent drug offenses, the criminal justice system could legally ban ex-convicts from participating in the same social arenas that Jim Crow laws prevented African Americans from ever reaching. Now, some people might argue, if you don't want to be convicted of a crime, don't commit the crime in the first place. But statistics show that's not even a fair argument. According to the Hamilton Project, at the state level, African Americans are more likely to go to prison for drug-related offenses, even though more white people use drugs than black people. And the rates of drug dealers between blacks and whites are relatively the same. Let's let that sink in for a little while. For a large majority of African Americans, nonviolent felony drug convictions is how they fall into the prison trap and are kept from being productive citizens. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 had what was called the mandatory minimum sentences, which could only have been targeted for African Americans. This is because of the racial gaps in prison sentencing. According to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine led to an automatic 5-year sentence, while it took the possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine to get that same 5-year sentence. You get 10 years for 50 grams of crack cocaine, while you needed a whopping 5 kilograms of powder cocaine to get the 10 years. And wouldn't you know it, it just so happens that during those times, approximately 80% of crack cocaine users were African Americans, while powder cocaine was more prevalent with middle and upper class white people. So it's not a far leap of thought to say these laws targeted African Americans. Even if we argue that the targeting of black folks wasn't intentional, we can clearly see that it affected African Americans at a higher level than white people, even though there were more white people using drugs and there were almost the same amount of black and white drug dealers. Here's the raw prison numbers for the war on drugs. There was a massive increase in incarceration for non-violent drug offenses. This jump was driven primarily by implicit bias and outright racial profiling when it came to police encounters.
The New York City Police Department stopped more than 500,000 people last year under their stop, question, and frisk policy. 87% were black or Latino.
According to the statistics, in almost all categories, black folks were more likely to have a negative experience with the police. So now that we established how a vast majority of nonviolent drug offenders got caught up in the felony trap, let's look at how a felony conviction makes being a productive part of society difficult. Each category varied by state, and also certain things change with time and parole, but for the most part, life for a convicted felon is not easy, especially non-violent drug felons. With a felony, you lose your right to vote, your right to be in a jury, your right to hold public office or be a candidate for public office. It becomes illegal to possess a firearm when you're a convicted felon. Finding a good job with a felony conviction is very difficult. According to the United States Equal Employee Opportunity Commission, it's not against the law for employers to ask job applicants about their criminal history. It's also not against the law for employers to discriminate against job applicants that are convicted felons. Student loans, financial aid, or federal assistance is out of the question if you have a felony involving a sale or possession of a controlled substance. Federal assistance includes any loans, grants, or work assistance. Finding affordable housing also becomes difficult once you have that felony conviction. To round all this up, let's look at the percentages of the prison population by race. According to the census, African Americans are incarcerated 5 times more than whites, with African Americans being only about 13% of the American population. Does it make any sense that they make up about 40% of the prison population? So there might be something to this new Jim Crow theory after all. And just a little disclaimer here. I hope we all realize this is a simplification of the root causes behind crime and mass incarceration. There are countless factors that contribute to the reasons why people turn to a life of crime and drug use. If you're interested, there are tons of books and studies out there that speak to this. Now that we know all this, what can we do about it? The very first thing that can be done is to gain as much knowledge about yourself in relation to the way things work in society and the world at large. Mass incarceration is just a small cog in a machine that is ultimately this thing we call a social system. We have the educational system, the political system, economic system, the medical system. All these systems have one thing in common, and that is they are based on rules. As such, some rules can be bent, some can be broken, and some rules can be replaced with new ones. But you don't stand a chance at success if you don't know the rules under which you're living. If enough people master the rules of the various aspects of this system and work a unified accord, I guarantee things will change for the better.